August 1944. Camp Lewis, Washington State. Günter Greve, 18 years old, wounded in a Normandy field hospital and shipped across an ocean he never asked to cross, stood in front of a small camp store. He had 80 cents in his pocket, wages from picking apples under an American sky. In his hand, two choices: ice cream, Coca-Cola, things that had vanished from German shops years before. He stood there, a prisoner of war, choosing between luxuries. He chose both. And in that quiet, absurd moment, something cracked open in him that no battle could have done. This is the story of what 425,000 German prisoners discovered about America, and why so many of them never entirely recovered from the shock. They came by Liberty ships, cargo vessels returning home half-empty from delivering war material to Europe. As many as 30,000 German prisoners arrived per month at ports in New York and Virginia, beginning in 1942 and growing to a flood by 1944. The men had expected a dungeon. They found something else entirely. The crossing itself was the first bewilderment. Aboard ship, the meals were substantial, far better than frontline rations. The soldiers of the Afrika Korps, veterans of Rommel's desert campaigns, captured during Germany's greatest early defeats in North Africa, had been living on short supply lines for months. The food on a returning American transport ship was, for some of them, the most they had eaten in a year. They ate it, and they said nothing, because they did not know what to say. Then came the Pullman cars. When the processing at port was done, the prisoners were loaded onto passenger trains, sleek, cushioned, climate-controlled American rail cars, and sent inland to one of approximately 700 camps scattered across 46 states. Imagine what he saw through that window. A continent undamaged, no bombed church spires, no rubble-lined streets, no rationing lines, fields, highways, gas stations with working pumps. The country simply did not look like a nation at war. It looked, to a young German who had watched his own cities blister under Allied bombing raids, like a different planet. Most of the camps sat in rural America, deliberately placed away from industrial and urban areas, as much for security as for practicality. The southern and southwestern United States hosted the largest clusters, where mild weather reduced construction costs and abundant farmland offered ready labor. But camps appeared in 46 of 48 states. Small towns that had never seen a foreign soldier suddenly found one living down the road behind barbed wire. The camps themselves confounded expectation at every turn. Other than the wire and the watchtowers, they resembled standard American military training installations. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required that the United States house its prisoners in conditions comparable to its own soldiers: 40 square feet per enlisted man, 120 square feet per officer. And America largely complied. 3 admirals and 40 German generals held in U.S. custody were sent to camps in Mississippi, where each received his own bungalow with a garden. The men ate the same rations as American soldiers: meat, vegetables, bread, beer. Coupons were issued daily, and the men pooled theirs, taking turns drinking several at once. Cigarettes, rationed for American civilians, arrived with regularity. Special meals came on Thanksgiving and Christmas. If a camp happened to have skilled cooks among its prisoners, and many did, the food was sometimes better than what the guards ate. The prisoners, struggling to believe their rations would not be cut, at first burned their leftover food to prevent any reduction. They had not yet understood. There was simply more here than they had been told was possible. Remember what Günter Greve believed at the start of his captivity? He was a boy who had joined the Deutsches Jungvolk at 10 and the Hitler Youth at 14. He had been told, as all of them had been told, that America was a weak nation, a nation of mongrels, the propaganda said, a nation without will, a nation that could not sustain the hardship of real war. Then he stood in a camp canteen with 80 cents in his pocket. 80 cents, his daily wage, paid in scrip, for picking apples or harvesting potatoes or picking cotton in the fields of eastern Washington and Arizona. He could spend it on ice cream or Coca-Cola or tobacco or writing paper. In a letter he wrote to historian Marie McCaffrey decades later, Greve said plainly, "I suddenly realized how extremely lucky I had been to be captured by the American army and not the Russian one." That phrase, How extremely lucky I had been. Carries everything. Luck. Not gratitude for mercy, exactly. Something colder. A recognition, rational and devastating, that the war Germany was fighting was, from a personal survival standpoint, already lost. More than 1 million German prisoners of war would die in Soviet captivity. Fear of Soviet capture was not paranoia, it was arithmetic. American captivity, by contrast, was a life. A strange, bewildering, well-fed life, but a life. But here is where the bewilderment deepened, because the camps were not simply comfortable, they were almost aggressively normal. Prisoners organized their own theatrical troupes. They built orchestras from instruments provided by American authorities. Local radio stations broadcast their music. Movies were shown as often as 4 nights a week. Prisoners who could not afford a projector pooled their savings to buy one. They published camp newspapers, some pro-Nazi, some anti-fascist, and wrote poetry and short stories and classified advertisements for items they wished to trade within the wire. Camp libraries filled with books. The American authorities, running a secret program they called the Special Projects Division, kept secret partly because it may have technically violated the Geneva Convention's prohibition on propaganda, stocked the shelves with German-language literature that had been banned under Nazism. Erich Maria remarks, All Quiet on the Western Front. Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. Books these men had never been permitted to read. One prisoner, Kurt Vins, wrote in the Intercamp Journal, Der Ruf. The call. Words that landed like a quiet verdict. Had we only had the opportunity to read these books before, our introduction to life, to war, and the expanse of politics would have been different. He was saying, in print, in a prisoner newspaper, that the education his country had given him was a lie. A professor named Walter Hallstein, captured in 1944, organized a camp university from inside the wire, teaching classes in his areas of expertise. He would go on, after the war, to become rector of Frankfurt University. The skills and credentials he carried out of American captivity helped rebuild a Germany that American captivity had, quietly, already begun to reshape. Hit subscribe right now, because what these men admitted when they were finally shown the truth about their own country, that is the moment that changes everything. Do not go anywhere. Not every prisoner was moved. Not every prisoner was even uncomfortable. The Afrika Korps men, the elite, the early captures, the ones taken during Germany's greatest military triumphs, often remained the most committed ideologically. They had been captured while Germany was winning. They carried that confidence inside the wire like a shield. They organized secret courts. They enforced loyalty through intimidation and violence. Prisoners suspected of sympathizing with the Americans were called white mice. Where there is great love, some were beaten, some were killed, the deaths arranged to look like accidents or suicides. The U.S. military eventually executed 14 German prisoners for murdering 3 fellow captives. 8 others served prison time for 2 additional killings. Historians believe dozens more such murders may have occurred undetected. For those prisoners who doubted, who had seen enough of the war's reality to understand what was coming, the camps were not just physically dangerous from the guards' side. They were dangerous from within. One anti-Nazi prisoner, speaking after the war, offered a line of quiet, bitter irony that has since become one of the most haunting assessments of the camps. There was more political freedom in the German army than in an American prison camp. He was not praising Germany. He was describing the terror inside the wire, where Nazi true believers held their own shadow government. He and those like him were eventually moved to Camp Rustin in Louisiana, separated for their own protection. But even the committed Nazis, even those who celebrated Hitler's birthday in secret after American authorities banned the observance, even those who threw Sieg Heils at the lowering of the American flag, even they could not ultimately ignore what they were seeing every day. The country did not match the portrait they had been given. Less than 1% of all German prisoners in America attempted to escape, half the rate of Italian prisoners, lower than the civilian prison system of the United States. The reason most often given by those who did try was not ideological commitment, not a burning desire to return to the fight. It was boredom. On December 23, 1944, 2 days before Christmas, 25 German prisoners crawled through a 178-foot tunnel they had dug beneath Camp Papago Park in Arizona. They emerged into the Arizona desert on a night in winter, intending to travel by raft down a river that turned out to be a dry riverbed. By January, every one of them had been recaptured. They had made it to freedom and found that freedom, in the middle of the American Southwest with no language and no contacts and no knowledge of the continent's scale, was simply impractical. Georg Gertner, a German soldier held in a New Mexico camp, escaped in September 1945, months after Germany had already surrendered. He did not want to go home to a bombed and broken country. He slipped away and lived under an assumed American identity for nearly 40 years, before finally walking into U.S. authorities of his own accord in 1985. He had spent 4 decades hiding inside the country that had once imprisoned him. He did not return to Germany. He chose to disappear into America. Then came the films. After the liberation of the Nazi concentration camps in the spring of 1945, American authorities showed documentary footage to prisoners across the country. Armed military police standing in the room as the images played. The prisoners called the footage Knochenfilme, bone films. At Camp Butner, North Carolina, after a compulsory screening, 1,000 German prisoners voluntarily walked outside and burned their Wehrmacht uniforms. Not ordered, not coerced. They built the fire themselves and stood around it and dropped the uniforms in. At other camps, prisoners called publicly for Germany to surrender. A handful, in a proposal that American military officials seriously considered before ultimately rejecting, volunteered to fight in the war against Japan. Scholar Arnold Kramer spent years interviewing former German prisoners. In all his interviews, he noted he never met one who admitted to having been a Nazi, and most, he found, had some knowledge of the concentration camps, though how much those captured early in North Africa knew of the Eastern Front, where most atrocities took place, remains unclear. Alex Funke, a military chaplain who had been considered politically unreliable by the Gestapo even before his capture, he had participated in the Confessing Church, a Protestant movement that resisted Nazism, said that while he had known of Nazi persecution and the existence of camps, he only learned the full extent of the Holocaust from media reports after liberation. "The 3 years in the camp," Funke wrote afterward, "were no lost, useless time for us in the course of our lives, but a lifting experience, which has shaped us." He wrote that from Germany, after going home, as a free man. There was one more shock, one that the Americans themselves found uncomfortable to acknowledge. Corporal Rupert Trimmingham, a black American soldier, wrote a letter published in 1944 in Yank, the weekly magazine produced by the U.S. military. He described stopping at a Louisiana Railroad lunchroom during a journey south. He was told, as a black man, to eat in the kitchen. While he sat there, invisible behind the counter, he watched roughly 20 German prisoners of war walk in under guard and take seats in the dining room. White German soldiers captured fighting for Adolf Hitler were served in a restaurant that refused to seat an American soldier who wore the uniform of the country holding them prisoner. Trimmingham ended his letter with a question the editors printed in full. He asked whether he was fighting for a country that considered the enemy more worthy of dignity than its own citizens. The camps, in this way, reflected something America had not fully confronted about itself. A November 1943 poll found that 74% of Americans blamed the German government, not German soldiers, for the war. That distinction, between the regime and the man, allowed for a genuine, if complicated, humaneness toward the prisoners. But that same distinction, applied inconsistently across the color line, produced the scene Trimmingham witnessed. German prisoners moved more freely through the American South than many Americans did. When the war ended in May 1945, the men expected to go home immediately. They did not. The majority of German prisoners continued working in the United States through 1946, then were sent as laborers to France and the United Kingdom for up to 3 more years. a delay that some historians have argued technically violated the Geneva Convention's requirement of rapid repatriation. During this period, with the convention's protections no longer formally in force, food rations were cut and workloads increased, particularly once the concentration camp footage had made the nature of the Nazi regime undeniable to an American public that had been receiving casualty reports by name in local newspapers all through the war. But even then, even with that late bitterness, the men carried something out. Most of them left with basic English. Some left with hundreds of dollars in savings, wages earned picking oranges, harvesting crops, doing work that American labor shortages had made genuinely critical to the war effort. In 1944 alone, the U.S. government received $22 million in prisoner wages and estimated it had saved $80 million by using prisoners in military installations. The labor force of the enemy was quietly essential to the Allied victory. After repatriation, approximately 5,000 German former prisoners emigrated to the United States. Thousands more returned to visit. Rüdiger von Weckmar, a former German prisoner, later served 14 years in New York City as Germany's permanent representative to the United Nations. The man Germany sent to speak for it at the Table of Nations had once lived behind American barbed wire. And Arnold Kramer's final summation, after decades of interviewing these men, sits in the record without embellishment. I've yet to meet a German prisoner who doesn't tell me that it was the time of their lives. Return now to Günter Greve at that canteen counter in 1944, an 18-year-old who had been raised in the Hitler Youth, who had lost his father to a war he barely understood, who had been taught that the enemy was weak. He stood there, and he bought the ice cream and the Coca-Cola, and he held both, and something in the calculus of the war shifted for him. Not dramatically, not with a speech or a revelation, but in the way that real things shift, quietly, without fanfare, in front of a small store window in Washington state. 73 years later, in 2017, he returned to Joint Base Lewis McChord at the age of 91, riding a bicycle from the gate to the site of his old barracks. He had come to say thank you. He pointed to a corner of a surviving building and said simply, "My bed was over there." That is what shocked them most about American prison camps. Not the food, exactly. Not the movies, or the libraries, or the Pullman cars. It was the realization, quiet and accumulating and finally undeniable, that the enemy had seen them as human beings. And that this simple, deliberate, procedural decency was itself a form of power no weapon they had ever trained with could answer. That is what the enemy confessed when they finally put it into words. That decency, applied consistently enough, is its own kind of force. If you're watching this channel for the first time, please subscribe and hit the bell. Every week we tell the war through the eyes of those who lost it, and these stories are worth your time. If this one stayed with you, give it a like, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We read every one. We'll see you in the next one.